All right, greetings. So welcome back to Racial and Ethnic Minorities. Um, this is for the week of November 15th, 17th, and 19th. And so we are talking about white fragility, and we are also talking about how to be an anti-racist. So as we are wrapping up the readings and the class, hopefully my goal is for you to take some to have some takeaways from the class, so that this class is not just a place where obviously you want to take the course, you want to learn some things, you want to get a grade and then leave and move towards graduation. And obviously that's what we all want. That's what I want for you. That's what you want for yourself. But hopefully you actually take some of this material and you actually learn something you can actually apply it to your life. So that is, for me at least, the goal for this class, and the goal for you is for you to leave being better people, hopefully learning, being better, growing, and helping to make your society, your world, a better place. So this week, we are discussing white fragility and how to be an anti-racist. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. How to be an anti-racist by Ibram Kendi. So what we're going to do first in talking about how to be an anti-racist, I actually did this exact, I gave this exact lecture in another class with the exact same information. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to input it right here so that you can see it, so that you can participate in the discussions and the thoughts and the YouTube links and all that other kind of stuff. So I'm going to insert it here, and then after that, come back, and then we'll finish up with how to be an anti-racist, because that is not in the other class. So I'm gonna finish up with how to be an anti-racist. All right, so here we go. So before we get into our next topic, I want to ask a question. And I want you to think about what this means, right, to you. What does it mean if you identify as white? What does it mean to be white? Or how has being white shaped your life? How has being white shaped your life? And if you do not identify as white, how have white people shaped your life? How have white people shaped your life? And I don't want you to just give me the sociology answer. It doesn't just have to be, oh, because I've had privilege, blah, 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 blah. But you can be really honest. You're not writing this down. If we were in person, we could talk about it. But just think about it if you want. How has being white shaped your life? Or how have white people shaped your life? And I can give an answer that is honest. I grew up in Jacksonville. I'm originally from Jacksonville, Florida. That's where I was born and raised. And I actually did not grow up a lot. I did not grow up around a lot of white people. I didn't know a lot of white people. Growing up, especially in my early years, everybody I knew was Black. My community was predominantly Black, more poor and working class. The church that I attended was all Black. There were no white people that went to our church. Everywhere that I went, it was always Black people. So I didn't see white people until I went to elementary school. And my mom and dad, now it would have been illegal, but at the time, they basically finagled me into being able to go to the school that was outside of my neighborhood. So that was my first time being around white people. And since then, the schools that I attended, I went to Darnell Cookman Middle School. I think it's called School of the Arts now or something like that. And then I went to Paxton School for Advanced Studies. And that's where I graduated from high school. And so those schools were predominantly white, but had some level of diversity. It would be considered, at least at that time, I'm not sure what it is now, but at that time, it would be probably more white. But there were Black people, there were Asian people, there were Latinx people, there were people of different groups. And then from there, I attended Florida. It was called FCCJ, Florida Community College. Now I think it's called Florida State College. And so in all of my experiences, then I ended up going to HBCUs, and then I graduated got my Ph.D. at a predominantly white institution. So I've had different varying experiences, been around different racial groups. Sometimes I'm the minority, sometimes I was the majority. And my experiences with white people, at least early on in my life, most of the time were either average or not that great. Whether it was a teacher or whether it was friends, well, not friends, but like classmates, things like that. It was rare that I would get these explicitly racist remarks. That was rare. Sometimes they did happen though from either teachers or classmates. But it wasn't like it happened every day, like some people may think about in maybe like a pre-civil rights era. But it definitely happened. But as I got older, I realized that white people looked at me differently, as opposed to me necessarily looking at them differently. So depending on where I was or what I've been through or what I had achieved or accomplished, that shifted. I saw a shift in the way that white people would then react to me. So I've had some negative experiences. I've also had some positive experiences. There have been some white people in my life that have helped me become the person that I am. And they were there to kind of help move me along. This typically happened in more of the latter part of my academic journey. It didn't happen much in Jacksonville or like with teachers or anything like that. That didn't happen much. I'm really trying to think, and I can't really think of that happening, like having a mentor. Now I did have a Mexican teacher. He was a mentor. He was great. And he actually inspired me a lot, but not many white teachers who did that kind of thing. But later on in my academic journey, I did have like white professors who helped me. I had white colleagues who helped me and provided me with opportunities. And definitely even now in my journey through a PhD, I have white colleagues who definitely helped put me in positions. So it became more positive as I got older, but early on, not so much. So that would be me answering that question, right? I guess it just depends on what part of life I'm in, whether it was positive or negative, or sometimes it just wasn't either. It was more indifferent. So that would be my answer. So just think about it. So what we're going to do in this next slide is we are going to talk about what's called white fragility. And we're going to look at the reading, talk about it. And I have some clips that I want us to look at, I want us to watch, and I want us to talk about as we're going through this, because these are some YouTube clips that I think really, really, really speak to what Robin DiAngelo is talking about in white fragility. So first thing, what is white fragility? So if we look on page 51, What is it? On that first page on the reading, and it says, and I will absolutely ask you this on an exam or something. What is white fragility? White fragility talks about how being white shapes our perspectives, experiences, and responses. White fragility helps us to understand how white people become so difficult in conversations about race. So when we ask, what is white fragility? Fragility itself is about how little it takes to set white people off. That's the fragility part. If somebody is fragile about something, that means when you talk about this particular thing, it sets them off. What's going on? Why would you do that? White fragility in this text talks about why when we discuss race, white people get sensitive. That's what Robin DiAngelo is asking. Robin DiAngelo is white, by the way. And so, and her line of race studies is whiteness. There's a line of race studies called whiteness. So if you're white or you're non-white and you're just interested in that line of race studies, then there's a whole set of literature for you. So how little it takes to set white people off is what we call fragility, particularly white fragility, and how we need to understand, or how being white shapes white people's perspectives, experiences, and responses. So then, what does it mean to be white? And oftentimes it means to belong. It means to be a part of something, but guess what? And still be an individual. Because whiteness in the American context is based off of individualism. The US is based off of a lot of our laws, culture is based off of what? Individualism. I can do what I want. I have the freedom to be an individual. You have the Bill of Rights, which lays out these individual freedoms that early people who are considered to be forefathers and foremothers of the United States say we cannot infringe on these individual rights because we felt we were infringed upon by the British. So we can't infringe on these individual rights of our people. And that's how many Americans, particularly white Americans, come into their lives. I'm an individual, I can do what I want, as long as I'm not hurting anybody. And to some degree, even if I do, depending on what it is, depending on what we're talking about, how much am I hurting them? And is it still going to be beneficial to me, i.e. slavery? Or how can I shape the narrative so that I'm not hurting someone, I'm hurting something, i.e. enslaved African people are considered to be things and property and not human beings. So whiteness is about individualism in the American context. And it tends to hold fast to this idea of merit. If I work hard, I can achieve success. So to lump white people into this idea of white fragility, it causes a lot of resistance because it causes white people to go against many white people to go against everything they've been taught. You mean just because I work hard, that doesn't ultimately mean that, or just because a person works hard doesn't ultimately mean they're going to be successful? No. Because there's a thing called privilege. It goes against everything they've been taught. It goes against what is often seen in the American literature and in their American history classes. That's why it's important to teach these things at a much younger age. So then when they get to college, oftentimes white students and sometimes even students of color aren't shocked. This should be taught at an earlier age so that they're not fragile. That could be it. That's an interesting part. I don't know if Robin DiAngelo gets into that as much, but that could be a solution for sure. So they're not as fragile when people bring up race or when people bring up slavery or when people bring up um not Oregon Trail, but the Trail of Tears, or when people bring up World War II, people bring up Hiroshima and Nagasaki and internment camps and all kinds of stuff. Also, when people bring up Pearl Harbor, people bring up 9/11. People bring up all of these ways in which things that can be linked to racial resistance or racial disharmony come up in conversation. It could just be a part of learning. And it doesn't have to hit people to a point where they're sensitive about it. So again, whiteness means to belong. So then how does Robin DiAngelo explain this in the text, this idea of belonging? How does she explain this in the text? Right? She talks a little bit about the fact that when you belong, it's not just that you're a part of a community, people see you as normal in that setting. You're normal in that setting. People don't assume that you're something else. And then she goes on to talk about how oftentimes Black people or Latinx people, when they're in certain settings, they're seen as being lower, or they're not appreciated, or they're not respected in the same way as if a white person was in that setting. Oftentimes people of color are seen as being the help, the janitor, the assistant, even if they are the person in charge, even if they own whatever it is that is there. So let's look at this clip. I want you to click on this first clip. I want you to tell me what happens in this, and then we'll come back. So you watched it. So what did you see? You saw this man, white man, and seems to be important, seems to know what he's talking about, speaking very confidently about whatever it is. He's talking to BBC News. So clearly he must know what he's talking about. Now, all of a sudden, this woman comes in and she's grabbing the kids. What's happening there? Who's that woman? Some people may say, oh, I don't know. Could have been his maid, probably, coming in. Some people say, oh, could have been his wife. I don't know. Somebody who came to visit his house. Let's click on that next link and start at 4 minutes and 26 seconds and then go to maybe about a minute and a half. Click on that link, start at about 4 minutes and 26 and then go about that long, and then we'll come back. So you see that this was his wife. So this Asian woman coming in to get the kids were not just his kids, they were her kids as well. And so this tells us about belonging. Some people may argue because he's a white man, he belongs. Nobody's going to question his authority or if he owns the house or anything. He's white. He's good. But this Asian woman, she could be a wife, but she could also probably be the maid. And a lot of people thought she was the maid. Why? Because she's Asian. In fact, He was in an Asian country. That goes to show you how hegemonic whiteness is. You can be in a country where you're the minority and you're still seen as superior. A person that looks like you isn't even the president or the emperor or whatever. But whiteness is a powerful thing. Whiteness is power. You can be in a predominantly Black space. I say it to Black people all the time because I see it all the time. You can be in a Black space, and if a white person shows up, all those Black people will change their behaviors for the white person, even if the white person doesn't tell them to do it or doesn't care. You have to watch what you say. You have to watch how you act. You have to make sure you don't say, make sure you don't don't do that. There's white people here, but they're not even the majority right now. But that's because race and racism and all these things are intrinsically placed and forced and is hegemonic in everything we say and do. You have to consciously fight against it. All people, white people, people of color, all people. So this woman says, no, I'm not his maid. This is my husband. They're on the same level. But that's what belonging is. Whiteness is belonging. Whiteness is always looking like you belong, even if you don't, or treated as if you belong, even if you don't. Which kind of goes into this next notion of the freedom from the burden of race. And the freedom from the burden of race. Let's look at that. Robin DiAngelo says, because I haven't been socialized, going to that section, that first paragraph on that section, because I haven't been socialized to see myself or to be seen by other whites in racial terms, I don't carry the psychic weight of race. I don't have to worry about how others feel about my race, nor do I worry that my race will be held against me. While I may feel unease in an upper class environment, I will take for granted that I belong racially in those settings. I certainly will not be the only white person there unless the event is specifically organized by or celebrating people of color. George Zimmerman would not have stopped me as I walked through a gated suburban neighborhood. So there's this burden of race where people of color often wonder, am I going to be the only one there? Black people ask themselves a question all the time. How many Black people are going to be there? Or how many white people are going to be there? Or is this a diverse place? All may not, but a lot of us do. Right? But that is something that comes up among conversations with people of color. And white, at least according to Robin DiAngelo, white people don't really ask themselves that question that much. How many white people are going to be there? Or is it going to be diverse? Because there's just this automatic assumption that I don't really have to think about my race like that. Because my race is what? Normal. I belong wherever I'm going. Not to say there may not be some level of singularity, right? If you have a white person in a predominantly Black setting, maybe a predominantly Black church or a predominantly Black college and university or whatever, you may get a few looks, but very rarely would there be anything intense, right? Also, with the freedom from the burden of race, there is not this idea that whatever I have, I earn. Because people of color oftentimes wonder, did I get where I am because of my race? Did they only hire me because they needed a Black person? Do my stats really, really matter here? Does what I bring to the table really matter? Or is it just because of my race? And Robin DiAngelo is saying white people don't really have to think about that. They just kind of, Not to say white people don't deal with what they call imposter syndrome. Everybody deals with imposter syndrome. but not in terms of race. It's more so in terms of, ooh, now how can I live up to whatever is expected of me? And I don't know if that is racialized. That's probably more of a psychology question. If you have a psychology class, you'll know more about that than I would. Okay. Then we move on to freedom of movement. She has a section called freedom of movement. So my question is there any place or space in America that a white person can go where they will not be respected and or protected? Do you think white people can go anywhere and not be respected and or protected? Some people may say, yeah. Yeah. Let's say, for example, you go to the basketball court and it's a bunch of black guys on the basketball court. And then the white guy shows up with his basketball. First thing you may hear, if we're honest, what this white boy doing on the court? He don't know how to ball. He can't play ball. Or maybe he can, and he wouldn't come up here if he couldn't. Let's see. So there may be, because of these stereotypes, right? These ideas around blackness, basketball, it's a black sport, blah, blah, blah. Black people can play basketball. Not to say white people can, there's a lot of white NBA players, but is this initial kind of, let's see, let's test it. If it was a black person, they would look like they belong. If a black person walks up on that court, they would automatically assume to be able to play until they show they can. With the white person, it's the opposite. That person probably can't play. Let me check and see. Let me just play some defense just to see. Oh, he just hit 3 threes in a row. Oh, okay, he can play. Let me see what he does here. Let me play him up close. Oh, he can dribble. Oh, okay. So white guy can play. Right? So there is some people may say, see, he's not being respected there. Well, it's not really disrespect, but there is a certain level of stereotypes happening, absolutely, for sure. Stereotypes, prejudice, I guess, if you want to use that term. But not really any disrespect. And the key to that question isn't necessarily the disrespect part, because there are absolutely places where white people can go where they may not be respected or they may be mistreated. It's not to say if a white person goes to every black event or black organization or anything with people of color, there are disrespectful people in all groups. So somebody may disrespect them. But the protected part is the different part. Because the argument is, if we look at like Jim Crow State of Mind, which is another article published by a doctor in sociology, Spatializing Blackness by Rashad Shabazz, would tell you, absolutely, white people can go anywhere in this country and be protected. Doesn't mean white people won't get hurt or even pass away, but they have a system. There is a law enforcement system, there is a criminal justice system that will go above and beyond to, if something does happen to a white person, they will receive justice. So either there is a protection of their body or there is a protection of their legacy or their story. It's very rare that won't happen. So white people have this kind of freedom of movement to be any and everywhere and be mostly respected and always protected. Either their protection of their body, if the police show up, the likelihood that a white person will be protected increases, and a person of color, not so much, particularly Black and Latino people. Also, white solidarity. What is white solidarity? Let's look down on page 57. White solidarity is the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage and not cause another white person to feel racial discomfort by confronting them when they say or do something racially problematic. Meaning, you're white, you hear a white person say something that's not good, that's racist, and you say nothing. You say nothing. You may actually experience this in another week or so. When you go to Thanksgiving dinner, and you may hear a cousin or a grandmother or a mother or a father or an uncle or whoever say something at the dinner table, say something racist, or at the very least, something that is racially insensitive. You may participate in white solidarity. You may not say anything. Why? Because you want to, at least in public, show that you have this solidarity, you have this, you are connected to them via whiteness. You don't want them to look at you as having more loyalty to a racial group that you may not, you're not even connected to. So you have to show this white solidarity. Happens with men all the time. Men are constantly around other men, and they may say something very negative about women, call women out of their names, derogatory names. And they may not do it, but they won't say anything. Why? Because they don't want to look, I don't want to look soft in front of boys, and I don't want to look like I'm like all feminine and all that. I mean, I don't think you should call women the B word or the H word, but man, that's just them. I just let them do their thing. Well, I'm not racist, but I know my grandmother, she says things and she's just from a different time. But I love my grandmother. I don't really want to say anything. I just let her just believe what she want to believe. That's white solidarity. And white people participate in it. And that is a way of silently still reinforcing racism by staying quiet. And oftentimes what we find with people who are the ones who are kind of helping other people participate in white solidarity, these people have this idea about the good old days. The good old days. The good old days says, as a white person, I can openly and unabashedly reminisce about the good old days, romanticize recollections of the past, and calls for a return to former ways, a function of white privilege, which manifests itself in the ability to remain oblivious to our racial history. Claiming that the past was socially better than the present is also a hallmark of white supremacy. And I wish we can go back to, you can go back to those days when things were this way. You may hear your grandparents say, man, those were the good old days. Were they good? You sure? For everybody? I don't know. Maybe for people that look like you, they were great. Maybe for people that look like other people, not so much. I want you to click on this link to look at how this idea of the good old days has been politicized. It's been brought into our politics, brought into our American politics. Click on that link. And then when you come back, we'll talk about it. So it's interesting. Trevor Noah's people's out there and they're saying, make America great again. Make America great again. Okay, well then that means it was great once before. When was it great? Some people say when our forefathers wrote down in the Constitution, everybody should be treated equally. Yeah. Sounds like a great time. If you don't consider the fact that those same forefathers, when they went home that night to go get something to eat, there was a Black woman bringing it to them that was considered to be not a person or a Black man who was still working, picking their cotton or their rice or their whatever, corn, and they weren't being paid. When was America great? Oh, America was great when we gave women women's rights. Well, Black women still didn't have rights at that time. Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until 50 years after that. The Voting Rights Act for everybody wasn't passed until 50 years after that. Was it really great? Make America Great Again. When was it great? Well, the first time that slogan became significant was in 1980s with Ronald Reagan. Was that when America was great? Some people may say, yeah. That was also the height of mass incarceration. That was also when racialized incarceration went from 40,000, and it was at the height in the 80s, and ended up being at about 400,000, 500,000, almost 500,000, with 60 to 70% of them being people of color, particularly, at that point, people of color. So when was America great? That would be the question. Obviously, there's some funny, there's some comedy kind of, but it's a real question. And it's part of what Robin DiAngelo was saying of the good old days. When we talk about the good old days, whiteness allows white people to look back at certain days as being good, when in reality, they weren't good for everyone. So white fragility is a very, and it's a whole book, but this is just one piece of it. But it's a very good text that gets at this new studies of whiteness. Something that was really first addressed, usually by Du Bois. By Du Bois in Darkwater, Souls of White Folk. He was really the first person to really look at whiteness, was a Black man. But this idea of white fragility is something that's very new among this millennial identity, among more millennial scholars. So that's why I think it's very important now that we're moving into more present day sociological theory, that we talk a little bit about not only queer theory, but also whiteness. All right, so you watched, the last thing you did was you saw the Make America Great Again. And so this notion of the good old days, right? You watch that. And so we can kind of see the way, particularly in white fragility, how whiteness, and both of these studies, both of these pieces of work can be couched in what we call in racial studies, or the kind of subset of race in sociology, people who study race and urban and things like that, is whiteness, right? So again, you can, if you decide that you want to go into sociology, you decide that you want to study race, you can study whiteness, you can study class, you can study gender, you can study sexuality, you can study the environment, you can study health, you can study criminology. There's just so many different places you can go. And even within those, there are even more specific kind of things that you can look at and study. So even within race, some people decide, you know what, I want to study whiteness, right? Me, I study race and class. So I study particularly the Black middle class. But I look at race and class, but then I also look at, what else? Education and things like that. So there are these subsets. So both of these you can look at this as being part of whiteness studies. Robin DiAngelo absolutely studies whiteness, and How to Be an Anti-Racist is a book that is geared towards anybody who wants to not be racist anymore, or wants to help to get rid of racism in our society. So this book can be applied to anybody, but most times, because it is the idea that people of color cannot be racist because racism is not linked to power, or racism is linked to power, then How to be an anti-racist is definitely something that white people can for sure benefit from. This is not to say that people of color cannot be prejudiced or cannot be discriminatory, but in order for a person to be racist, they have to have power, they have to have connection to larger authority. There has to be a certain privilege within race that they have. And that automatically excludes people of color. So that's that. Anyway, so with that being said, I think How to Be an Anti-Racist definitely wraps this up really, really well. And I would highly encourage you, if you're interested, to just, read, get the whole book and read it and check it out. It's very, very interesting. And I love how he brings in his personal struggles, his personal goals, the things that he's going through in his everyday life, and then how he applies that to race and racism, particularly within this chapter, talking about his struggle with cancer, right? His struggle with cancer is huge, and how he connects that to racism. So we'll talk about that in a second. But at the beginning of this chapter, he talks about his wife. I think his wife is, or maybe his partner, girlfriend. I'm not really sure, but and I think he talks about it more in other parts of the book. But having cancer, and again, he then finds out that he later has cancer, right? And so he's thinking about this notion of cancer, not just in the medical sense, not just in the biological sense of him having it, but also in the sense of him, racism as a cancer, right? And so then he goes all the way back and he talks about the source of racism. Where does racism come from? And he talks about one of the reasons why he became a college professor. And he became a college professor because he said he wanted to educate away the ideas of racism. And he wanted to educate away the ideas of racism. He saw ignorance as the source of racist ideas, because people were ignorant, because they didn't know any better, right? This was the reason why racist ideas existed, okay? And we actually talked about this in one of my other classes. I believe it was my sociological theory class, where we talked about James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and how James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote very similar books, one published in 1963, one published in 2015. Between the World and Me, 2015, Ta-Nehisi, James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, 1963. And what James Baldwin says is that to him, the source of racism is exactly what Ibram just says. It is the ignorance that white people have, the miseducation that white people have about race, about racism, about privilege, and about the world in which they live. He believes if we can bring white people, educate them, show them what's happening, show them the differences between these two worlds, right? What Dr. King calls the two Americas, or is it the two Americas or the other America? I think it's called the other America. And he actually got it from something else he read. He was talking about poor people. They were talking about poor people, but you also have a Black America and a white America. Now, obviously, President Obama says that there is no Black America or white America. There's no, not a Democratic America, Republican America, but there's the United States of America bringing everybody together. But in reality, there are different countries in which we live. Now, it shouldn't be that way. Everybody should have the same access, but there are different realities, right? If we're honest, and even President Obama is honest about that. He's not, oblivious to the fact that there are different experiences within the same country. With that being said, James Baldwin states, famous author, writer, civil rights activist stated, if we can just educate white people, then that will help us get rid of racism. That will help us reach equality, right? If they're willing to sit down and listen. And it is up to us as Black people to teach them, right? It is up to people of color to teach white people what is happening, to teach them about the world we live in. And if we can appeal to their moral conscience, then things will get better, because once they realize, oh, this isn't right. Oh, okay, I see now. Then things will get better. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in 2015, and his conclusion is different. He's like, nah, I don't think so. Maybe to James Baldwin in 1963, in the middle of the civil rights movement, in the middle of these protests and revolutions, maybe that might be the case. But it's 2015. I see, you know, me being younger and looking back, he would not necessarily agree, though he is a huge fan of James Baldwin, his writing style. You can tell by the way he writes and looks at him as a phenomenal figure. But I think, and maybe a 2015 James Baldwin would have felt the same way as Ta-Nehisi Coates, probably, more than likely. Anyway, I'm kind of going off topic, but I'm on topic because what I wanted to connect you to is Ibram, now the author of this text, basically saying the same thing James Baldwin said in 1963, right? The source of racism, he thought, was this ignorance, right? That particularly white people had. And if he could just become a professor and get into the classrooms and they take his class and he can educate these young white people on the realities of race, things will be better. What he finds is that that's not the case. What he suggests is that the source of racism is not racist ideas. The source of racism is racist policies. And looking at mental change, he says, as the principal solution, but seeing myself, an educator, as the problem solver, he says, wasn't necessarily the thing. He says the source of racist ideas is not ignorance. He says it is self-interest. Self-interest, which kind of goes back to things that we talked about in the beginning of the course. Remember when we read Short History of Race by George Frederickson? And he talks about how, he kind of talks about it, and I talk about it, how capitalism preceded racism. Europeans did not grab African people as cargo for this American project because they were Black. They had no problems with Black people. In fact, many of them looked up to African people, to African pharaohs and kings and queens and kingdoms and all that, because these were the oldest civilizations. They learned from them. They learned from their books. They learned from their teaching. So there was no issue. But the need for labor was, well, these people would be better for labor, so we're going to use them. We need these people to make money. So they created this transatlantic slave trade. But then they infused these additional policies and the need for greed, the self-interest of money, all right, because originally they were indentured servants, and that wasn't uncommon during that time. That's why many Africans agreed with it. Sure, you can take these people, they can help build up your country, you bring them back. That's how it's always been. Little did they know, self-interest, according to Ibram Kendi, would take over. And Europeans got greedy and said, well, we don't want to give them back. We're making a lot of money. To have them just do this for 7 years? No. So they started to extend it a little longer and a little longer until they started to pass policies that said when we have them, they have to be slaves forever. no freedom, self-interest. And then came the racism part. Because again, it's all about capital, it's all about money at first. Then they say, well, now we gotta, because we're doing this and it's wrong, we have to justify why we're using these people. So how do we justify it? Well, now we come up with this idea of race. What is race? Well, we'll call us white, we'll call them black. And we'll say, well, these people were savages. They lived in jungles. They lived in huts. We're civilizing them. They are not people, or they're not humans, they're property. God put us in a position to rule over them because we're better, because we're smarter. So all of these different ideas were created to justify this system that they already had put in place. Capitalism preceded racism, not the other way around. And a large part of capitalism is what? It is self-interest. And so when we look at, according to Ibram, when we look at the history of racist ideas, we see that it is a history of policymakers, according to Ibram. I agree with some of what he's saying. I disagree with some of what he's saying, but I'm just teaching, I'm just giving you this idea. So he says that the history of racist ideas is the history of powerful policymakers creating racist policies for what? For self-interest. And then they use these policies to push out racist ideas. So for him, he's saying racism didn't just come about out of these ideas. They came about because of the self-interest of Europeans, of early Americans, of early US citizens, well, they were British citizens and then branched off and became their own country, US citizens. And they started to create laws like the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act. If a person is born of slave blood, they have to take the status of the mother, not the father. Why was this done? So that this can allow for the raping of African women, while still controlling the sexuality of white women. That means white woman, if you get pregnant by an enslaved man, that child is free. But white men, if you rape an enslaved woman, your child can still be enslaved. You're not losing money. Now it's your self-interest sexually that you're able to maintain, and your financial self-interest. And how is this played out? Through a policy, through a law. There was an actual law that was voted on that allowed for this to happen. That's just one small example. All right. Other examples. How were eventually enslaved people were allowed to be later on freedmen after the Civil War? There was a policy, the 13th Amendment, 14th and 15th Amendment. How was this undone during Jim Crow? There was another law that was passed, Plessy versus Ferguson. It was through that court case that said separate but equal was constitutional. And how was that undone? That was undone through another law some 70 years later, or 60 or 70 years later, that said you cannot keep students from going to certain schools based on race. That undid, but so there's these laws, policies. And it is out of these policies that people get ideas. Where did Jim Crow come from? Jim Crow ideas were secured out of the Plessy versus Ferguson verdict that allowed for certain policies to be put in place. And then, so now you have these racist ideas, and then they're defended and they're rationalized through policies and more policies and more policies. So he says, while everyday people consume racist ideas, this actually turns into ignorance and hate. So it is the policies that creates the ignorance and creates the racist ideas that creates the ignorance and hate. So what he's arguing is that if we just treat the ignorance, then all we are doing is treating the symptoms. He said it's like if you have cancer and you go to the doctor and they're treating all of the symptoms of the cancer, but they're not actually doing anything to make that tumor shrink in your body. That's the problem. So we can't try to beat ignorance and hate, because ignorance and hate really just stems from being allowed to practice these ideas. And how are you allowed to practice these ideas? Because of policy. There was when Hillary Clinton was running for president. This was at the a person may say the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. There was absolutely no way Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump would win the election or have a campaign and not address the Black Lives Matter protests, regardless of whether a person agreed or disagreed. You had to address it. It was just too big. And someone asked Hillary, they said, asked her about what she wanted to do about racism. I can't remember exactly how this went. I hope I tell the story right. I want to say they asked her about what she was going to do about Black Lives Matter or something like that. And she gave a response that they didn't like. I thought it was good. But she said, my job is not to make people non-racist. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to convert or convince people not to be racist or not to hate, because I can't do that. What I can do is fight for policies and laws and legislation that make it difficult for those people to carry out those ideas and execute them. I can make it difficult for them to be protected by the law. That's what I can do. And so she didn't say it like that. It was more of a quicker kind of explanation, but that's essentially what she was trying to say, and the person didn't like it. But I understood what she was saying. Because during the civil rights movement, the idea that James Baldwin had was very much the idea that Dr. King had. Dr. King said, we want to appeal to the moral consciousness of this country. We believe in the democracy. We believe of what this country wrote on paper. And if we can just appeal to that and bring this to their attention, things can get better. The Black Power movement, Stokely Carmichael, his people, Malcolm X, that line of revolution, that line of protest says, no, I can care less whether you like me or not. What matters to me is how you're able to treat me. That's the important thing. I can defend myself. If you attack me, can I attack you and be let off on self-defense? I can protect myself. I don't need anybody else to do that. It's just unfortunate that when I do, I'm the one that may get put in jail for the rest of my life and you try to attack me because of racism or whatever. So it's what is allowed and not necessarily how a person behaves. And this is the shift that Ibram is making. And so as he's thinking about this, he's saying, I don't think I need to forsake anti-racist research and anti-racist education. He's not saying that what I'm doing is wrong. He's not saying he should stop being a college professor. He's not saying that he should stop being a college professor or he should stop researching about race. But he's saying I needed to forsake my orientation to anti-research and education. And I needed to make sure that I was not just researching and educating to change the minds, but that I was researching and educating to change the laws. That is what his goal was. At the same time, though, it's not to say that minds shouldn't change. We should. If while we're doing this, people's minds are changing, that's absolutely great. Why? Because those minds could soon be the minds that enter into the spaces of power. We talk a lot about the Brown v. Board of Education. We talk a lot about the civil rights movement. But if I'm honest, could that have happened without Chief Justice Earl Warren? It was a white man who was the Chief Justice on that Supreme Court. And he actually, which I do think a documentary should be made about that gentleman. I really do. Because he passed a lot while he was in his position. There were a lot of laws that were passed and that were allowed that created the environment for the civil rights movement to be successful. We have to be honest about that. Not a lot of people talk about Chief Justice Earl Warren, unless you like a pre-law or you go to law school. So Earl Warren did a lot of good work, but someone had to have, at some point, whether he was young or he was in college or he was in law school or whatever, had to have convinced him the way we're living isn't right. And if I get the opportunity and I get in a position of power, I'm going to really make a change. And he did that. He did that. So my response to the brother who wrote this is I do believe in policy more so, but changing the minds, yeah, that's still important because it is those minds that get into those who in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, we're voting for in Congress, in the Senate, to be judges who go on to be Supreme Court judges, federal court judges. It is these minds that get it. And hopefully while they were going through college, they had professors, they had mentors, they had people who helped them and made sure they stayed on the right path and taught them these things that I'm teaching you. Hopefully, when you leave this course, this stays in your mind so that when you do get into positions of power, you can say, I remember that class. I remember I took a class on that and I'm seeing all this play out. And I can in good conscience go back on that after receiving this information. Hopefully, that's the goal. And so then Ibram lays out some solutions. He lays out solutions. Let me pull it up really quickly here. Um, 141. Oh, so if you go to page 141, he said, these are the steps that we could take to eliminate racial inequity in our spaces. Number one, admit it. Admit that racial inequity is a problem of bad policy, not bad people. This is what he believes. It's not about bad people, it's about bad policy. Number two, identify racial inequity in all intersections and manifestations. Again, intersectionality, we have to address it. It's not just about one part or one area. You can't just say, oh, we got to go to the South. You know, the South is known for being racist. No, it's everywhere. The South, the North, the West, the Midwest, the poor areas, rich areas, and classrooms, on the streets, in churches, everywhere. Investigate and uncover the racist policies causing racial inequity. Look at these policies. What are the racial implications? Invent or find anti-racist policy that can eliminate it. Brown v. Board eliminated a racist policy. Other policies eliminated a racist policy. Figure out who or what group has the power to institute an anti-racist policy. Who can do this work? Who institutes policies? Legislators. Congress. Who puts them in office? Voters. Who can take them out of office? Voters. Who can demand what it is that they put forth? Voters. Disseminate and educate about the uncovered racist policy and anti-racist policy correctives. Talk about it. Talk about this work that Ibram is putting forth. Work with sympathetic anti-racist policy makers to institute the anti-racist policy. So people should work with these policymakers to make sure that this comes about. Deploy anti-racist power to compel or drive from power the unsympathetic racists. So those people who are not doing this anti-racist work, get them out of office. Monitor closely, I didn't finish that, unsympathetic racist policymakers in order to institute the anti-racist policy. Monitor closely to ensure the anti-racist policy reduces and eliminates racial inequity. It's not just about putting the law out there. Now we got to look at that law and make sure that law works the way we want it to work. Don't just say, oh, we got the law passed, now we're good. Make sure it's working. Make sure people are executing it. And if not, there needs to be a punishment for that. When policies fail, do not blame the people. Start over and seek out new and more effective anti-racist treatments until they work. I'm not sure how much I agree with that. But if we're going to focus on policy, then we need to create laws and policies that will work to ensure that people are following them and to ensure that if you don't, there's a punishment involved. Monitor closely to prevent new racist policies from being instituted. Because remember, we live in a republic. So representatives change. People change. Politicians change. Presidents change. Senators change. So we have to stay on this all the time. This has to be a regular part of our everyday voting patterns. Next slide. Now, Ibram makes this more real. One of the things he says, our world is suffering from metastatic cancer. And he talks about his own battle with cancer. It's a very powerful chapter. If you haven't read it, I would highly suggest it. And he talks about his own battle with cancer, finding out that he has colon cancer at a stage 4 level. And he doesn't have much time. And he says, our world is suffering from the same cancer that I'm suffering from. Racism is a cancer. And he says, and it is spreading all over our body politics. It is a part of everything. It is a part of the way in which we victim blame. It intersects with bigotry of all different kinds. It heightens exploitation and misplaced hate. It spurs into mass shootings and arms races and demagogues. And it polarizes nations and marginalizes people. It shuts down essential, I like this part, it shuts down essential organs of democracy, and it threatens human life with nuclear wars and climate change. And then particularly in the United States, he says this cancer of racism has spread and has been spreading to kill the entire American body. And it did at first, or it almost did, before it even began with the Revolutionary War. And then it nearly did again with the Civil War. But very few people, unfortunately, will look inside their body of their nation, of the racial inequities, of the neighborhoods, the racial inequities in their neighborhoods, the racial inequities on their jobs and in their institutions, and will admit that this exists, that this cancer exists. He said, just like me, when I found out that I had cancer, the first thing you do was what? Deny. You didn't, oh no, this can't be. It's not happening. Dude. Denial is the general response when you're dealing with something like this. It's the popular strategy. But he says denial is like suicide. You're killing yourself when you deny these things. And he says it's much easier than admitting it. But when you admit it, when you confess it, I do have this cancer, this does exist. Cancer is likely to kill me, but I can survive it. Now you can deal with it. He says, when people say, my society is racist, it's at its most serious stage, and this can kill my society, this can kill my country. My country will never be able to fully be what it could and should be if we don't address this head on. This is the first step. But then you can go as far as saying, but guess what? I can beat the odds. This country can beat the odds. I can survive this cancer, and my country can survive this cancer. That is the idea. Obama said the same thing. Dr. King said the same thing. John F. Kennedy said the same thing. We recognize this, but we can beat this. And most people, when they're dealing with the healing process, dealing with a chronic disease, they want to be as comfortable as possible. They try to make themselves feel as comfortable as possible. But pain is essential to healing. You have to feel the pain. You have to feel hurt. You have to. This is when you know that the work is being done. So if you're talking about race, or you're talking about racism, or you're talking about anything that is hurting our society, and it gives you a twinge, it makes you feel uncomfortable, that's good. If you always feel comfortable about everything that's going on, everything that you're doing, then it's not real. And it just continues to go on. But if you're doing something wrong and someone lets you know, hey, you know what? That's not actually a good thing you're doing. It may hurt your feelings for a little while, but at least now you can come to grips with it and you can do better and be better. So he says pain is essential to healing. When it comes to healing America of racism, we want to heal America without pain, but you can't heal without you can't heal without pain. You can't make progress without pain. Your feelings have to be hurt. You have to look at your country and say, oh, wow, this is messed up. It's painful, but it's necessary for progress. You have to feel uncomfortable. You have to be told, you know what, this is racist, or this isn't right. Oh man, when is this ever gonna, can I ever be that? You have to go through that process, that learning process. And it doesn't happen overnight. Racism wasn't created overnight. It took time, years and years and centuries and policies. It took time. But there was an agenda of self-interest that was important, and people were loyal to that. And people were dedicated to that self-interest. And that's how this racist society that's how it got to where it is. So that same loyalty and dedication has to be put into being an anti-racist society over time. And so these are some of the things on the next slide that Ibram says we can do to heal the US body of the cancer of racism. If you don't read it, he actually does fall into that 12% that survives the stage 4 colon cancer. So he's writing from a certain place where he says, we must saturate the body with the chemotherapy of anti-racist policies that can shrink the tumors of racial inequities. And the anti-racist policies can be the chemo that can kill the cancer cells that we can't even detect. Get rid of the racist policies that are cancerous in our societies. Ensure that there are margins, clear margins, no cancer cells of inequity left in the body. Only the healthy cells of equity, only the healthy cells of anti-racism. Encourage the consumption of healthy foods for thought. And regular exercising of anti-racist ideas. All of this can reduce the likelihood that racist ideas will recur. Monitor the body politics very closely, especially where the tumors of racial inequity are likely to come up again. Treat the recurrence early. As soon as we see it, treat it so that it does not continue to threaten the body. But what does he say we have to do before we do all of this? He says you have to first believe that this can be done. Believe in the country, believe in the process, believe in the people, believe in the democracy. When you can believe that it can be done, then all is not lost for you and for the society. So a very, very powerful text by the good brother Ibram. I highly encourage you to read it in its entirety, the book, or at the very least the chapter. I was going to give you an assignment, but you have a class assignment next week anyway, and you also have holiday break, and then after you come back, you're going to have an exam soon. So make sure you are studying for that. I hope you enjoyed these lectures on white fragility and on how to be an anti-racist. If you have any questions, reach out to me, email, inbox, or come into my office hours, and I will give you your assignment, your class assignment. Probably won't be a video, but I'll just give you, because I want to say I think it's a class assignment. I'll just give you your class assignment via Canvas. So I hope all is well. Look forward to talking with you, communicating with you. And have a great day, great week, and great weekend.